Dear ladies and gentlemen, warm welcome to all of you. It was a great pleasure for me and Folk och Försvar to get the opportunity to arrange this afternoon session on the occasion of the visit to Stockholm of Mr. James Townsend, who is the US Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for European and NATO policy. We sent out the invitation with very short notice, and we were almost overwhelmed with the response. Well, no surprise. Our guest has many friends in Sweden, and we are many that have been very interested in getting to meet him or you. So it is a little bit crowded in this room, but I hope that you feel comfortable and warmly welcome. Mr. Townsend is here with us today to talk about the security situation in Europe and in the Baltic Sea region, US defense relations in Europe, and US-Swedish cooperation. Our aim is to have an interactive hour, and I would like to encourage all of you to be active when we have the possibility to ask questions. Before I leave the floor to Mr. Townsend, just a brief summary of his background. As the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for European and NATO policy, Mr. Townsend is responsible for managing the day-to-day defense relationship with Europe, the EU, and NATO. Before taking up his current position, he was a Vice President of the Atlantic Council and Director of the Council's Program on International Security. He joined the Atlantic Council after a distinguished career at the Pentagon and at NATO. And in the 1990s, he was the Principal Director of European and NATO policy, the Director of NATO policy, and the Director of the Defense Plans Division at the US mission to NATO. Before beginning his tour at NATO, Mr. Townsend served for 8 years as Deputy Director of European policy, where he was very involved in the NATO enlargement and building new relations between the US and the emerging democracies of Central and Eastern Europe. From 1990 to 1994, he was the country director for Northern Europe, where he developed new defense relations between the US and the Scandinavian nations. So, Jim Townsend is no stranger to Stockholm and not to Sweden either. Warm welcome to you. And now I leave the floor to Mr. Townsend.
Could I have a cup of coffee? That would be sure. Good. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for that introduction, and it's great to see you all. I have a lot of old friends in the audience, so in terms of this audience engaging, that's what I'm afraid of, because I know where many of you come from, and I'll be getting a lot of hard questions. But it's great to see you and to have this opportunity, which I don't think I've done in the times I've come to Stockholm to sit down and do some outreach like this. And I'm very glad to have the opportunity. And having worked in a think tank before, I know how it is to get an opportunity and to have like a week to get invitations out and to try to get things going. So thank you so much for that, and for all the work that your staff did to set all this up. There's a lot for us to talk about, and I want to do a couple things. One is I want to give you some insights into, thank you so much, coffee. I went through the MFA, the MOD, I've been running around, and now I need some coffee from now. But what I want to do is to give you some insights into what I'm working on at the Pentagon in terms of Europe and NATO, and give you kind of a broader continental view from Washington on what's happening there, and then talk a bit about the bilateral relationship between the United States and Sweden and how it's grown and how it's developed over time, which is quite remarkable. Since my early days as the Swedish country director, and I see some old colleagues here who were there with me during those days. And what has been built since those times is just tremendous. And I think the meetings that we had yesterday and today really are representative of a relationship that has just blossomed. And I think the transatlantic community has certainly benefited from that. So I want to talk about that, and what I'll do first off, though, for those who don't know me, maybe what I'll do is I'll tell you a bit about what I do on a day-to-day basis, so you get an idea of the range of issues that we deal with, and you can ask questions and into areas that you might not know that I have to work. So as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Europe and NATO, I'm a political appointee. Which should entice you a little bit because that means I'm an Obama appointee, and with the elections coming up, it puts me into a very interesting time to see who will win. And usually what happens with us, it's not so much in the Swedish system, but in our system, after a presidential election, political appointees like myself, we're out. Sometimes on our heads we're out. Sometimes we walk out the door with our heads held high. Just depends on who's elected. And so as we get into this campaign season, I am keeping one eye on that. But I have pledged that I will stay on until the bitter end, if not to take home and complete a lot of work that we're doing in Europe, particularly with Sweden. And so I'm going to stick it out until the moving van shows up and I have to put all my things in the moving van and then we leave. So what I do as this political appointee is I have to handle our day-to-day relations in two aspects. So I have two offices. The first office is our bilateral office, and that's where the day-to-day relations with the European nations comes to the fore. And so, for instance, in front of me are two members of my staff, one who has the country portfolio for Sweden, Stacy, and then Maya, who helps to do this. We had to divide Europe into two, and so that part of the office does up here in the north and in the west. Maya helps to work, and she, of course, did Germany before she took this job. So, as examples, whatever defense issue comes to the fore on a country-by-country basis ends up on my plate. So whether it's Germany, whether it's Sweden, whether it's Turkey, whether it's the UK, those relationships, those defense relationships rest with me to do. And those issues come, and if you deal with Turkey, for instance, you deal with Syria, and you deal with Iraq, and you deal with the Kurds, and you deal with ISIL, and if you deal with Italy, you're also dealing with Libya, and you're dealing with ISIL. So in my particular job, there is not an issue, I think, that I don't have to work one way or another. And it keeps us very, very busy. Even the migrant issue, the president talked to Chancellor Merkel and other European leaders, and he supported very much that perhaps NATO could have a role in the migrant crisis. And 2 minutes later, my phone rings, and all of a sudden I'm having to try to figure out what NATO could do when it comes to handling the migrant crisis. So for me, I never know what is going to be on my plate. And so if you want to talk about the migrants issues and how we can handle this, what is this, a tragedy of people fleeing Syria, I'm all ears because we're working that as well. The other part that I do is NATO, and that's another part of my office. Working and shaping the U.S. Policy towards NATO and U.S. views on NATO issues takes up a lot of my time as well, going to ministerial meetings and supporting Secretary Carter in that, dealing with defense planning, what's the future of NATO, the Warsaw Summit, NATO and Russia. That brings also on my plate a lot of unusual issues as well. So I will tell you that my days are never boring. But in thinking about NATO, though, I really have been a great pleasure for me to have worked Sweden both in those early days as we began to build a defense relationship with Sweden as the Cold War began to end, on the one hand, and then on the NATO side, to bring Sweden closer and closer into partnership with NATO. It's been a great partnership between the alliance and Sweden. Sweden brings so much to the day-to-day work at NATO in terms of ideas and in terms of engagement that it's really been a model of how we can work with nations in Europe, not members of the alliance, but who share our concerns with European security and defense. So that's what I do, and I have worked this, as was said, since about 1990, if not before. Actually, in the 1980s, I was working on some aspects of Europe, and what I have seen now over the past year and a half to 2 years has been a security situation I just am unprecedented in terms of the velocity of the crises that come at us, how fast they come, the complexity of these crises, how they're so interrelated and the solutions so complex that, quickly coming to the fore with a way ahead to solve a problem, that's not happening. And as we try to sort these things out. And then the concurrency of these problems, the fact that instead of the luxury of having just one crisis come at us at a time, they come at us in 2s and 3s and 4s, sometimes all on the same day. And you go from meeting to meeting to meeting, and you go from one problem to another problem to another problem, no time for lunch, and at the end of the day, you're not sure what you've accomplished. And I haven't seen it like this before. And it's not just me in my office, but it's here in Stockholm as well. My counterparts in the MFA and the MOD deal with a similar range of problems. The same thing in other capitals in Europe. And as we meet as political directors, we sit there and we compare notes of how to deal with these problems that suddenly have surrounded Europe. As you remember well, as looking on Europe as a place of strategic stability, looking on a place where we knew that we needed to engage in security issues, but those security issues were outside of Europe. At NATO, we used to say out of area or out of business, as we looked at NATO to be expeditionary and to go off and do issues, whether it's in Afghanistan or in the Balkans or wherever it might be. Today, we have, it seems, all around Europe's periphery, problems and issues of different types. None of them are the same. Each has their own complexity, their own characteristics, and we have to deal with them all at one time. And we have to deal with security problems within Europe as well. And Paris was a great example of a security situation within Europe that, as far as France is concerned, as it now looks at its military, it has to deploy its military in France to patrol the streets to try to deal with terrorism there. And if you're in Brussels, you see it's similar there. San Bernardino, we have those problems. We've seen those problems with us. And so as you look at the problems in Europe, it's at the periphery and it's internal to Europe as well. And again, it's just unprecedented. And so how do we deal with this? I get asked all the time, well, Jim, what's NATO going to do about this? And I say, well, that's a good question. What is the EU going to do about this? These institutions like the OSCE that we've developed since World War II, that were so important during the Cold War and are still important, how are those institutions going to help us with these peculiar problems that we're having to deal with? How do we deal with them on a bilateral basis? What are we going to do as individual nations to handle these issues? Libya is a great example where the UN is involved there, trying to help stand up a nascent government in Tripoli, but Italy is also very involved too. Italy trying to put together a stabilization force at some point when there's an invitation from a new government that can go in there and help that government stand on its feet. We've seen that kind of thing before in the past, but whether it's Italy acting, whether it's the UN acting, whether there's a NATO role there in the future, we are finding that the tools that we have developed aren't necessarily in the right place or are not necessarily the right tools to deal with these issues. And I think one of the first observations just to bring to you is that we have learned a lot since Afghanistan and Iraq. We've learned a lot since 9/11 in terms of helping and the Balkans too, by the way, in the 90s, in terms of helping nations stand on their feet, in terms of helping build governments where there might not have been a government before, and help them take on governance in a place where there is violence and where there's terrorism. We've learned a lot in terms of what doesn't work, but what does work is something that we're still working on. It's still a work in progress, and personally, I feel that there's a lot more work we've got to do to come up with these things that can help us in a situation like Iraq, Syria, once the fighting ends and we have a political transition in Damascus and we have a new government that we hope will stand up there, what happens after that? How can we help that nation with its governance? What tools do we bring? What tools do we use in a society as complex and as bruised and damaged as they are from years of conflict? It's a daunting task, and so as I go about my daily work, these are the things that I have to think about. I have to try to figure how are we going to be able to use the resources that we have to go in and try to bring stability to the European periphery. And this isn't even touching on what we are seeing up in Ukraine, what we saw in Crimea, a lot of the bullying tactics that we've seen in the Baltic area as Russia conducts exercises that intimidate and throw into doubt this island of stability that we've always enjoyed in the Nordic-Baltic region. And so we find ourselves dealing with a security concern that's more traditional up in the north. As we once again begin to see Russian maneuvers, exercises, surface ships and aircraft do things that we haven't seen since the Cold War days. And I was part of the Cold War days. Many of my colleagues here were there too, and this is familiar to us. And it's something that just, for me personally, it's a tragedy and a disappointment that this trajectory that we were hoping that Russia was on has seemed to have deviated to this degree. And we hope that there'll come a time when the governments in Russia will take Russia back on the path that we certainly thought they were on in the mid-90s. During those days when we used to talk about Russia joining NATO. I remember going to the Hill and talking into our Congress there and talking to staff about whether that could be possible, and that was in the mid-90s. So we find ourselves confronting tragedy in Syria. We find ourselves confronting a big challenge in Libya. We find ourselves confronting a disappointment and a rising concern in the north with Russia. We see ourselves with unfinished business in Afghanistan, and that involves all of us too. Sweden played a very important role and continues to play that role in Afghanistan, and we're all up there, and we all want to make sure we finish the job there with the new Afghan government and with the Afghan National Security Forces, so that we can bring peace and we can bring some stability to a place that has known nothing but war for so long. There's Pakistan. If you start in Afghanistan, you swing down through the Middle East, Iraq, where there is unfinished business as well. Syria, the challenges that come just with the Kurds there in the northern Iraq and their aspirations, and how they are part of this fighting as well. Russia down in Syria. It's a tremendous load, and it's something that. As I look at our partnership with Sweden, I'm very glad that we have you all as a partner with us in this. Because in this kind of environment, in dealing with these kinds of challenges, it's not the military forces that you bring to the table that you're going to be able to use as a tool to end these problems that we see there. Military solutions are not on the list for many of these crises that we're in. It all plays a role, and I'm trying to do my bit on that, and I'll talk about that in a minute as well. But more importantly, it is the civil side. It is the ideas. It is the developmental thinking. It is the human resources that come to the fore that will help us deal with the real problems in these regions. Sweden plays a tremendous role in that. The resources, the human resources, the human capital, if you will, that Sweden brings is going to be critical if we're going to handle Syria post the transition in Damascus. I've seen that work in Afghanistan. We were just in the MFA, and we talked to some of the foreign ministry folks there about what what ideas are out there and how we can handle the civil stability problems that we're going to have in Syria and other places. There's a lot of good thought going on here. So I wanted to make sure in my presentation to you that you know how much we appreciate that aspect of what Sweden brings. It's critical. The Swedish military brings a lot too, I will say that. We exercise and train and work with the Swedish military in many venues, and that's also welcomed as well. But it's rare to have partners like Sweden that bring both a military capability and bring a human capital capability in terms of ideas and sophistication in dealing with issues. It's rare when you work with a nation that can bring you both, and that happens here in Sweden, and I just want to make sure that before I finish, you understand that. One last bit, and then I'll close off and we go to questions, which are always more fun than listening to me, and that is, as I look at my job right now in terms of dealing with threats to the European security community, and that's NATO. It's everyone. I'm not going to make a differentiation between NATO and non-NATO. I think probably one of the most important things that I do on a daily basis is to try to strengthen deterrence in Europe. It's to try to make sure that whether it's Putin or anyone else understands that the United States is engaged in Europe. We haven't rebalanced to other parts at the expense of Europe. We're not all totally focused on Asia. I think there's been a misunderstanding for years about that particular policy, and that is Asia is very important. China is very important. Our focus there is very important, but it's not at the expense of Europe. And so we are engaged here. I want to make sure that not just Putin, but you know that. It's important that Putin and others see that the deterrence that we need to be strong about, and the Article 5 in NATO that is part of that deterrence, our commitment to that is very strong. And you might have heard over the past few weeks that for a third year, we're going to be putting a lot of money into ensuring that the United States, in terms of our force posture in Europe, troops that rotate here and equipment that we might need here to handle any kind of threat, to back up that deterrent, to back up our commitment to Article 5 at NATO, that this money is going to make sure that equipment and that capability that the United States provides is in Europe. It's here. It's physically here. For a number of years, we rebalanced and pulled equipment out. What we're doing now is coming back in, not the way we looked in the past, not the way we looked during the Cold War, because we're not in a Cold War. But we're coming back in such a way that we will be able to take on whatever threats might come our way in terms of NATO, in terms of the credibility that comes with Article 5. And each year we get stronger and stronger, and our presence gets more and more capable. And you're going to see over the next year or so a lot of manifestations of that. And so for me and for my office and a lot of what we do, whether it's expressed at NATO in terms of decisions that we made at Wales, at the Wales Summit, and decisions we'll make at the Warsaw Summit. You might have heard about the so-called NIFUs and all these acronyms that NATO is putting together to show that NATO is going to be ready. Well, the U.S. is going to be ready as well. And you will see manifestations of that in terms of forces rotating here and pre-positioned equipment. All the things that I never thought I would see in this day and age back in the mid-90s when we worked so hard to develop PFP and a Europe whole, free, and at peace. I did not think we'd find ourselves doing these kinds of things. But we are, and we will do that because we need to do that because of the importance of deterrence. Because I am firmly convinced that the nightmares that people might have about conflict breaking out in Europe can only be staved off by a very strong deterrent. And the United States provides a lot of that. And I'm going to make sure before I leave that capability is there, and that it's a credible one, it's a rehearsed one, and that those that would do us harm, whether they're in Moscow or elsewhere, will know that the United States is here and we're engaged and we're not going to leave. So I'm going to close off at that and just go right straight to questions.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for a very good and comprehensive presentation. Indeed, there are loads of uncertainties in our neighborhood, and the question is how to deal with them. I will open up for questions. Please just raise your hand, and I will bring in directly Sebulon first, and then we have Robert Dahlsjö.
Sebulon Karlander, Fria Moderata Studentförbundet. Firstly, I'd like to thank the United States for your continued commitment to European security. And secondly, I'd like to pivot from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea and ask, how is the US, together with your allies and partners, responding to the Russian militarization of the illegally annexed Crimean Peninsula? Thank you.
Shall we do one at a time, or you want to cluster them together?
I think one at a time.
Okay. Well, that's a great question, and a very important question too, because I think there is a lot of attention that is paid to the situation in the Baltic, and I know that the Poles particularly are very vocal about their situation as well. And the Baltic area, not only is there the situation in Crimea, but there's also Turkey. And I think what we have seen over the past 6-8 months is a lot of Russian movements of equipment and Russian activities and rhetoric certainly that are aimed at intimidating Turkey, that are aimed at trying to establish a tactical picture around Turkey in terms of Russian equipment that is there, that is intimidating in and of itself. This is something that impacts not just Turkey, but it impacts Romania, Bulgaria, it impacts the Black Sea region, and it is something that we have to pay a lot of attention to. I will say with Romania and Bulgaria, I was just there talking to my counterparts about their military capability, how we can train together. A lot of the funding that you heard about, $3.4 billion with a B, billion dollars that we were asking Congress to provide to pay for our engagement in Europe. Some of this will go towards exercises and training there. But I think what's particularly important is the maritime presence on the Black Sea. That is something that I think in terms of the alliance, there needs to be an understanding that that Black Sea is not a Russian lake now. That the Black Sea nations should not be intimidated by a growing maritime presence there by Russia, and those maritime nations around the Black Sea, their navies, I think, are eager to work with ours. They're eager to work with NATO, with the NATO standing naval forces, to exercise and train and to be a presence to demonstrate that they can steam on the Black Sea. They can do things there and not feel intimidated or bullied at all. And I think having a presence on the Black Sea, both NATO as well as from these nations, are critical. And so we are working with those two, Romania and Bulgaria, particularly with their navies. I'm hoping in the next few years you're going to see a good connection with those navies to help them increase their steaming hours and their capabilities so that they can be a presence there. I think the Turkish Navy can be certainly part of that, and Georgia, Ukraine as well. So I think part of what we need to do in that part of the world is, again, looking at deterrence. What will deter Putin or anyone else from thinking that they can go in and bully or intimidate or try to manipulate these nations? They are NATO allies, Romania, Bulgaria. They are part of Article 5 like anyone else. And so it's really something that as an alliance, but also bilaterally as the United States, it's an area that we've got to pay a lot more attention to, working with Turkey as well. But that ties into the crisis and conflict in Syria. And as you know, there's talks going on now as we try to come up with ways in which you would implement a cessation of hostilities, and also talks going on to try to deal with a political process there. Fighting continues. It's the complexities, and the audience like this knows very well the complexities that you find in Syria. And Turkey is a part of that. And Turkey is bumping into Russia there, and vice versa. And so this adds to this feeling of instability and this feeling of uncertainty in that Black Sea region. So as we look at, as you are in Mons at SHAPE, or you are at NATO headquarters in Brussels, you have to look at this, the problem, the challenge, almost theater-wide. I talk about this in terms of looking at the challenge from Canada and Alaska, if you will, and work your way all the way down across the Atlantic, across Iceland, across the Nordic nations, down into Central Europe, and all the way to Turkey. The entire flank is seeing intimidation and both whether it's maritime or whether it is air flights in northern Canada, and certainly you've seen it in your region quite a bit. Iceland has. I was in Iceland 2 or 3 days ago, and I got quite an earful there. And so this is something that if you're at NATO and you're looking at problems, it's not just one part of NATO. It's the entire sweep. And you have to continue that sweep through the southern allies as they deal with Libya. And they deal with the migrant flows and the tragedy on the high seas that the migrant flow brings. So you're busy if you're at NATO headquarters, and you're busy if you're at SHAPE. And what I don't hear anymore at NATO is, whither NATO, do we still have a role, The answer to that is yes, but we got to find out exactly what that role is. And that kind of, your question has many multiple questions to it, and one of them also is NATO's role. And what is the appropriate NATO role as you look at whether it's the Black Sea, whether it's Libya? We have an ISIL is a big threat, but it's being done by a coalition led by the United States. So where's NATO in that? So it's so whether it's in the Black Sea or other places of the NATO frontier, it is something where it's something where we're having to bring to the fore every tool that we possibly have, as well as generate new ones to handle these kinds of issues. So that's a long answer to a short question.
Just a quick follow-up on that, the tool issue. Is there any specific tool that you would like the alliance to have that you don't have today?
Boy, that is a great question. Yeah, there is. I think the tool that I wish we had right now at NATO, and I think we're getting there, is a tool that can combine NATO and the European Union together to go in and handle a crisis situation like Libya. I'm just going to use Libya as an example. How this unfolds, I don't know. The Italians are very much involved. The UN is very much involved. But in my fantasy world, having a NATO and an EU that can work together, where NATO goes in and can provide the security space for the EU to come in and use. The EU has a military capability as well. I'm not going to push that aside, but if the EU has such strengths in the civil side, whether it's in terms of monies that can be invested, people that understand governance and can understand how to help nations build where it wasn't there before, having those two institutions come together and in an efficient way and a fast way go in and handle these kinds of problems, that's a tool. That's a powerful tool. We try. NATO and the EU talk about this all the time. I've gone through my share of EU meetings, and they can take a long time. We're working at NATO on timeliness in terms of decision making and in terms of how quickly NATO can put together ready forces. But what I'm talking about here isn't necessarily going in and fighting a fight. What I'm talking about here is NATO and the EU coming in and handling an ungoverned area, or an area like Syria will be that has been beaten, and where so much of its middle class has left. And as they try to stand up a government and try to come back together again, they're going to need a tremendous amount of help. And we're going to need tools there that we don't necessarily have right now. And if we could have that as an example, to go in there and on the civil side, tools developed based on lessons learned from Afghanistan, from the Balkans, from Iraq, tools that we have a better confidence in of working, because we know that they have worked in the past, or we know what didn't work in the past. If we can capture that on that civil side, as well as lessons learned on the military side, and go in and handle that, I think that would be a wonderful thing. What I don't want to do is reinvent the wheel. And I don't want to go and just repeat past mistakes. I think we have learned a lot since the earliest days of the Balkans crisis in the 90s. We've learned so much. I'm hoping that there is a way that we can capture that and we can employ that in these future challenges.
Thank you. Robert Dahlsjö.
Thank you. Jim, NATO and the NATO allies are clearly in the process of retooling towards Article 5. And that process will not have ended by Warsaw. Warsaw will just be a waypoint. But how far in the terms of new posture and forward presence do you think you'll be by Warsaw? And also a counter-argument to forward presence is often we must abide by the NATO-Russia Founding Act. But when you look at it, it is far from clear as to where those ceilings are. Thank you.
That's a lot of questions in that question, and they're all very good. First, on the NATO-Russia Founding Act, I was around when that was developed. I wasn't one of the framers, but some of my bosses were, and there is a lot of ambiguity in that, and I think purposely so. But the NATO-Russia Founding Act, obviously the Russians have breached that NATO-Russia Founding Act. I think in terms of the alliance, we hope one day that the Russians will rejoin that agreement. They will come into compliance with it. So right now, that document itself it's still out there, but it certainly is not, when one of the parties is in breach, it doesn't hold a lot to it. But I will say, though, that in terms of what NATO feels it might do or what the U.S. feels it might need to do on a bilateral basis in terms of force posture, there are no plans that we have that would bump into the NATO-Russia Founding Act. So that has not been something that we've had to worry about because we're not going to build a big base in any time soon. We're not going to build a big base, and we're not going to have a full-time presence somewhere. That's going to be numbers that would raise eyebrows when it comes to those kinds of concerns. But again, the NATO-Russia Founding Act, I think it's a pity. It's an absolute pity that documents like that are so important to the international community and to our structure, that the Russians are in breach of it. But we're not going to. Our plans are not going to be thwarted by that document or by that. And we look forward to the time when Russia comes back to the NATO-Russia Founding Act. But your question is, well, then as we get to Warsaw and beyond Warsaw, what does it look like in terms of forward presence and that type of thing? And you also mentioned Article 5, and I might have something to say on that too. But in terms of what things are going to look like for forward presence, much of what we're looking at now, the United States is, in terms of our force posture, is based on rotation of forces. And part of the $3.4 billion that we're asking Congress for is going to go towards helping us increase the time that our forces are rotated into Europe for training and exercises. It's going to allow for us to pre-position equipment in Europe that we can use, whether it's for training or to handle a contingency. So our force posture and how our forces are used in Europe are not going to be something where they're going to go to a particular country and sit there, whether on a full-time basis or in a newly constructed base or something like that. So our forward presence is going to be based on rotation of forces, and it's going to be based on exercises and training all along the NATO frontier. So that's the U.S. on a bilateral basis. At NATO, what is NATO going to do? It's going to be something similar in terms of rotation of forces. As you know, NATO doesn't build bases. There's not a NATO base in the sense that we're used to from the Cold War. There are bases that have a NATO flag at them and where there's maybe a NATO entity, but NATO doesn't go around building bases like in that conventional sense. So I don't see NATO having a forward presence that is centered on a base that you would build. It's going to be rotational as well. It's going to be, and they're working on that now. This is going to be probably based on maybe multinational units that would deploy and train, and that would work with host governments, for 3 or 4 months, come back. There's a lot of ways in which we're going to show presence, forward presence, without it being something that's a full-time 1950s style base being built in the new allies, in their territory. So much of post-Warsaw is also going to be focused on readiness of forces. If you're going to have rotation of forces for exercises and training, if you're going to have a deterrent that's based on being able to put forces quickly where they need to go, we're going to have to improve readiness at NATO in terms of our forces. There's a lot of forces that are on a 90-day or even longer readiness level, and that's not going to work as we deal with particularly Russia, that seems to be very quick to move forces and have a snap exercise or do these things that show how mobile they've become and how quick they have been, how quickly they can move. NATO needs to be able to do that kind of thing as well, and not just to handle Russia. This is a very important point too, whether it's the so-called VJTF or other NATO forces. There could be contingencies in the south. It could be in Turkey. It could be other places where NATO will need to move quickly. So as NATO looks at its force posture and what NATO may need to be able to do, it's just not up in the north. It's down in the south as well. And that's part of this NATO adaptation you're going to hear a lot about at the Warsaw Summit, as NATO adapts itself to handle these new challenges. And I guess that takes me to your point about Article 5. I didn't hear all of it. I don't think actually you're asking a question about it, but you were talking about what NATO is going to do to support Article 5. And this adaptation of the alliance is all about keeping Article 5 credible in terms of the alliance being able to do what we need to do should Article 5 be invoked. And so there'll be initiatives coming out of Warsaw that will be oriented towards readiness, oriented towards mobility, and oriented towards capability.
Thank you. Well, I have a long list of names now with names that want to ask questions. So let's take two at a time. Sure. So we try to squeeze in as many as possible. Please.
Yes, hi, my name's, Carlfrid Kleberg from the newspaper Expressen. So basically on deterrence, because the idea of diplomacy, as it is said, is sort of speak softly but also carry a big stick. Now,
Teddy Roosevelt.
Yes, exactly. Now, given Syria and Ukraine, and previous to that, Georgia, many put forward the idea that Russia is simply willing to use this stick and European or the US, well, Western countries basically aren't. And the criticism is that this undermines both deterrence but also other foreign policy. So I'm curious what you would say about that criticism, and perhaps then, if you agree, what could be done to reverse this? Thank you.
Thank you. And then we have Mike Winderstig, please.
Sir, Jim, great to see you here.
I said no questions from you. You asked too hard questions.
I know. Just an easy one for you. In quantitative terms, we have heard a lot about the 3.4 billion extra money for the European Reassurance Initiative at EUCOM, right? But could you set this in a perspective? What's roughly the entire annual budget of US EUCOM these days?
I knew you'd ask a hard question. I knew it. Can we just do two?
Yeah.
So the speak softly and carry a big stick, and the fact that Russia seems to be using the stick and the West doesn't. I guess I would look on it this way. The Russians are using a stick. And I think we have been slow to recognize that they use a stick, and they use a stick not just once, but multiple times. If you look at Georgia, if you look at what's happened with Crimea, then you look at the Ukraine, they seem to not to have a democratic problem with using a stick. And you made the point that the West doesn't. And I'm very glad the West doesn't use a stick in terms of, or at least certainly in the ways that the Russians use a stick. You don't see us going around and doing the kinds of things that the Russians do. But the West has a stick. Sweden has a stick. NATO has a stick. And our stick, though, is used to deter and to warn off those who would come against us not to do that. We don't use the stick in a way to conquer others, to enslave others. We don't use the stick to enforce a faulty concept or ideology that that person wielding the stick seems to have. Those that use the stick in Georgia and Putin using it in Crimea, that's not how we use our military capability. Our military capability is used here to deter and to respond to those that would do us harm. And we depend on that. You know, we depend on those that would do us harm to understand that the risk is too high for them because of our capabilities and because of our willingness to defend one another. And so I think it's something that you said speak softly and carry a big stick. I think we in the West are able to speak softly too. If you define that as dialogue, if you define that as trying to handle problems without resorting to conflict and violence as in the first instance, I think we try, whether it's diplomacy or whether it's through foreign assistance or whether it is through the international institutions, I think all of us bend over backwards to use tools that are not a military mallet. If that's how you want to speak in terms of speak softly. I don't see the Russians being very adept at that. And if they do use that tool, I think it's more to manipulate than to try to solve a problem. That's my personal view. But I think in terms of the other tools that we also have that military tool, and that backs up the diplomacy. It backs up the other efforts that we make to try to solve conflict and solve problems without resorting to it. But we have that as a backup, and we have that to make sure others know that if they want to do us harm, and we've worked through the speak softly, that there's a big stick there too. And my job is to make sure that that big stick that we have is capable. It's one that is credible. It's one that we're able to use with our friends and allies. And it's one that is respected by those that would do us harm. But it's not something that we would use the way the Russians seem to use their stick in terms of going into Georgia or other places and solving problems that way. So that's how I would get to that point. Now, what was the budget number you wanted? It was for Shane. We just happen to have someone from UCOM. I know that you all have heard of UCOM. Here is someone in the flesh from the European Command.
Oh, thank you. As has been said, not an easy question to answer, and mainly that's because of the component makeup of UCOM. And so, you know, for the Marines, the Special Operations, Air Force, and Navy, they'll all work individual budgets. And to further complicate that, they are working those budgets through the big departments back in the United States. And so to give those actual numbers versus that 3.4 billion is very difficult. But the point is to those ERI monies is it's giving us the ability to do some things that we think are very good in the East towards those countries. You know, there's a lot of ideas and thoughts here that are going to be, I think, very beneficial to this whole endeavor, and that's what these monies are being able to be used for. So.
Thank you, Shane. You know, you answered that so well, you're going to take my job, which isn't, you know, I shouldn't have given you the opportunity to speak. But I think what Shane says is very important. I think is, you know, I would say that the 3.4 billion, again, Shane said this, you know, that goes to pay for our costs to do things. So it's over and above what had already been budgeted for in terms of what the Marines might do. And again, the monies go and pay for not just for those things done by U.S. forces already in Europe, but it's also as U.S. aircraft leave the United States and go to Europe to exercise and train with the Swedish Air Force or others, as we have ships that might go into the Black Sea and do Black Sea maneuvers and that type of thing. Their costs are paid for out of the $3.4 billion. So it's not in the base budgets that Shane was talking about that the big services have. This is given to them to help them do things that have been unbudgeted for, but we need done. So it's over and above. And I can tell you the $3.4 billion is over and above a lot of what the services have budgeted for their training and exercises in Europe. And I think it's important to say here, as we talk about this, that a good bit of that $3.4 billion, and one of the reasons it's as large a sum as it is that goes towards helping us bring prepositioning. It helps us to preposition equipment in Europe. It helps us to maintain these rotations longer, as I mentioned earlier. It goes towards helping strengthen that U.S. force posture here on a rotational basis, which prepositioning will help us do, and that type of thing. So it's all oriented towards credibility, towards capability, working with allies, keeping NATO as strong as we can through these exercises. But I tell you, it comes to work with partners as well. Sweden, and I want to keep bringing it back to you all because it's important for you to know that as we work together bilaterally or in a regional basis with NORDEFCO or however it might present itself, these monies help us come and train with you all too, whether it's Baltops in the Baltic as was last summer, or whether it's doing air training with you in different places, or there's big exercises coming up this summer. So this helps us work with you, and which is always a good thing for us. We get along quite well out in the field. So,
thank you. We are running out of time, but we have now two final questions, and we'll see if we can squeeze in one more. But Anke, please.
I'll keep my answers shorter. But.
Okay.
Anke Schmidt-Veldsman, Swedish Institute of International Affairs. You were talking about credibility and deterrence, and I would like to push you on two sticks that are hotly debated on the one hand internationally, or not debated very much. In Sweden. One is the nuclear weapon as a stick, because you will be aware of the many debates in Sweden and the strong criticism and reservations. And on the other hand, I would be very interested in your views of the role of offensive cyber capabilities, because the Swedish defense minister mentioned that explicitly at the Munich Security Conference, but not very many people pay attention to it, and it is hotly debated at the international level, but not very much in Sweden. Finally, I also wanted to ask you about trust as a very important element of NATO as an alliance, and also of the United States as a military power, because you also are very well aware of the criticism in the public domain against NATO, against the United States, and while across the whole of Europe, in Germany in particular, also in the United Kingdom and in Sweden. So what is the US doing to repair or rebuild the trust, and what would you recommend even the European states that have that same skepticism against national military forces? What can and should they do to rebuild trust? Thank you
very much.
Could I just take that one, because there was 3 questions in there, and they're all very good, and I appreciate that. I don't mind being pushed, although if I get in trouble, it's going to be your fault. First, the easy one, which is the nuclear one. There is no such thing as nuclear prepositioning, or a. We don't, in terms of the United States and nuclear weapons, or I won't speak for the UK and France, but that capability is something very tightly held, very tightly controlled, something that you don't preposition in another country, or you don't store in another country, or you just don't let other countries come in, and that is something that is, nuclear weapons we've had to live with during the Cold War days. We still have them. It's a fact of life. It's a feature of life. It's a feature of the military structure, and it's one that is a very heavy burden. It's one that is one that you don't approach lightly. And so I know there was a debate about. I think it was about NATO putting nuclear weapons somewhere. NATO doesn't own nuclear weapons itself anyway, but the United States for sure. When we talk about prepositioning of military equipment, that never involves prepositioning nuclear weapons. in a way like we are talking about in terms of prepositioned equipment, this type of thing. So I think if there's lots of things to debate, this is one that is not. It's not fact, and so it's something that I think we could use the time to debate something else. What was the second thing before trust?
Offensive cyber.
Oh, offensive cyber. Well, that's, cyber as a weapon is a fascinating thing, and that's just come upon the scene. All of us are struggling with cyber in terms of how do you defend against it? There is such a thing as offensive cyber, so how do you use that, and what are the unintended consequences from that? How well does it really work? Is it in fact something that can be used and so avoid battlefield casualties and civilian casualties, which could be the case? Is it possible that you use offensive cyber and it doesn't work? And so you find yourself making assumptions about a weapon that in fact don't come true. So all of those things, as the United States or other nations, as they look at an offensive cyber capability, those are all the things in everyone's mind because this is so new. What are the unintended consequences on using cyber? If you have an offensive cyber usage and you all of a sudden you cause these things to happen over here that you don't want to happen, I mean, no one really knows. So offensive cyber and cyber itself as a weapon of war is something that has to be carefully considered, carefully looked at, something that can be helpful in warfare, maybe avoiding mass casualties. There's no such thing as a silver bullet anywhere, but this is something that I think, we work in. We have a cyber command. We have a lot of people who write about cyber in the United States. So it's something we're looking at very, very, very carefully. Other nations are too, according to their own policies and doctrine and procedures. And it's something that's new. And Sweden is a very technologically advanced nation, and certainly cyber defense is something that's key for everyone. And so, I'm sure your minister is like lots of ministers who is as good as he is, and he is a very good minister. He's having to look at all kinds of things, and so that's on cyber. On trust, that's a very important question. I've gone through almost 30 years of working with Europe in various ways, and the trust issue, or do we share values, really? That question ebbs and flows depending on the crisis of the moment. Certainly during the Iraq days, it was a dark time for us as we found ourselves confronted with horrible situations in Iraq. And reactions in Europe and around the world on various things, it was a tough time. And there was this question asked about, do we share values? And I just think that's so sad that we even had to ask that question, because we do. And so this problem of trust comes from, I think, what's his name? The guy who was Snowden, Snowden and WikiLeaks and all that type of thing. That had presented us a challenge along those lines too. Germany, you pointed out, and other nations where this has come out, and it's been something that's really heartbreaking in a lot of ways, because yes, there's trust there. Yes, we trust each other. That trust is bedrock. That trust is the NATO alliance. That trust is our bilateral relationship. That trust is the day-to-day things our two nations do culturally, through business, through the arts. It's all underpins trust. And sometimes these things happen that can bring some people to doubt it, or to feel that the United States has gone rogue. I mean, being the power that we are, that comes with the job description too. And it just does. But I can tell you, having worked this for almost 30 years now, that doubt ebbs and flows depending on situations. But I can tell you, it's rock bottom in terms of how the trust that our community, our transatlantic community shares, whether you're in NATO or not, whether you're a partner or not. I know some people can look on events and question that trust, but that is short term. It is something that passes in the night, because that trust, when times are hard, when we need to come together as a community, after something like Paris, or dealing with problems like migrants or whatever it might be, we are in this together, and you can trust us to be there. We're not perfect. We are absolutely not perfect. We bumble along sometimes. We bump into things. We sometimes make a wrong policy choice. But I tell you, a feature of our government and of our peoples is that we will come around and get it back on track if we get off track. You can trust that. We will. And when the chips are down, we're always there. And I think a lot of our response to what's happened with Russia and that type of thing shows that we're going to be there. So I can just tell you that from a personal basis. So.
Thank you very much. I think that we could continue for hours. This has been a very interesting hour. But we need to finish. We run out of time.
One more? You want to do one more? Okay.
That's yours, yeah? Okay, then it's Christian Dehn, please.
Okay, good to see you again, Jim. Sad that we are discussing the same problems and concerns that we did some 25 years ago. I have a short follow-up question to Robert Dahlsjö's question. One of the results of the end of the Cold War was that the NATO command structure in Europe has been reformed and adapted in several steps.
It was very painful.
And one part of that is that a large part of the NATO command structure in the north has been dismantled. And now my question is, how do you look upon that when things now are changing? What needs do you see in the future adaptation that maybe goes in another direction?
Concerning command structure.
In of the NATO command structure in the north, yes.
Boy, you guys, we'll get really wonky now. We're going to just dig right down into that. No, it'll be a short answer. So Krista, I had to do that NATO command structure reform back in it was in 2009, 2010, and I tell all of my colleagues who might mention maybe we should redo the command structure. I say no, we're not gonna redo the command structure to the degree that we did. But there have been calls, and maybe at Warsaw, that there needs to be tweaks to the command structure to take into account what we see. Whether it's with Russia or other places, are there changes to the command structure that will help us be more nimble in terms of command and control? Are there things that we can do to help with the manning in terms of the numbers of people at these headquarters and what they're looking at? I think for Norway particularly, Norwegians have said for a long time, and I'm sure you heard this too, they've been concerned that there wasn't enough understanding at NATO and at Brunsum, that there wasn't enough understanding about the High North and the North Atlantic and this type of thing. And they still very much believe that. And so as Norway talks about command structure changes, and I know that's on their mind. I won't speak for them, but you can talk to Norway. But so I think there will probably be some command structure reviews to see if we need to make some changes. I don't think there's any major changes that we need to do. I think we need to fully man the headquarters with very top quality people, and the U.S. is as guilty of that as anybody else. We've got to make sure we adequately man it. I think having situational awareness or regional awareness is something critical, whether it's the High North or whether it's the Mediterranean, whether it's the Turkey and its environments. I think that's something, yes, we need to take a look at. But other than that, in terms of changing the command structure and how we go about commanding bodies of troops, I think we're okay. But we'll see what comes out of Warsaw. I think there's some in the NATO military structure that might disagree with me, but I don't think now is the time. We just implemented what we decided back in 2009, and I know things have changed, but I think some might say it's too small, that we need to have a larger command structure just because of the number of things happening. That might be some truth to that. But let's take a look and see. But regional awareness is important, and being able to take on disparate missions, whether it's dealing with air policing, if you will, for Turkey, or helping them with air sovereignty, whether it's dealing with, if you're in Italy, NATO in Italy, dealing with Libya, whether it's dealing with a Russia contingency up in the north. NATO's got a broad variety of different kinds of missions it could take on, if not what it's already doing. And so it might be that we're going to have to make some changes. But I don't see a wholesale change the way we did in 2009. Does that get to your question? You sound doubtful.
I think he looks very satisfied, and so are we. I would like to thank you so much for sharing part of your afternoon here with us. At Folk och Försvar, if you participate as a speaker, you always get a book from us. And I would like to hand over a book to you, along with a small, nice little red horse. And I believe that you haven't read this book, but I'm not quite sure. We'll see. But thank you so much, and a warm applause.
Thank you very, very much. And thank you all.